My name is Ansel Adams Cody. That's right, Ansel Adams, after the photographer. My father named me that despite my mother's protests. He was a photographer too, amateur, obsessed with images of plants around Rainy Lake, where we lived in northern Minnesota. He even had a display of his shots at the public library one time. Dad taught math at the local high school, but the camera, that was always his first love. Yeah, first love. He loved it more than anything. Mom took to calling me Andrew. I took to telling people that really was my name, especially after Dad left when I was 7. He told us he was going into the woods again, but I knew different. He'd packed 2 suitcases instead of 1 camera bag, and he left $100 in cash on the kitchen table. No note, just the cash. I remember when he went out to start his old pickup. Usually he had to pump the choke 3 times to get it going, but this time it fired up on the first try. For most kids, a parent disappearing like that would be the worst thing that could happen during your childhood. Unfortunately for me, it wasn't. Not by a long shot. I don't want to bore you with the details. If you read the paper or read the news sites, you probably heard the story a million times. It was the 70s. Nobody who volunteered to work with kids was viewed with suspicion. If anything, it made a man look sensitive and heroic, and if that man, that Little League coach or scout leader, had the kind of unusual habit of inviting boys on private camping trips, well, that might raise a few eyebrows, but no one would do much of anything about it. The man was probably a nice guy, a charmer. They were always charmers. And besides, if the guy was doing anything wrong, the kids would say something, wouldn't they?
Now remember, this is our little secret.
Would kids turn in an adult? An adult they liked? Maybe the only adult who helped them with their schoolwork? Listened to them? Gave them things?
You'd get in just as much trouble as me, and we couldn't be friends anymore.
Sure they would. But one nice thing about childhood horrors is that you outgrow them. The 3-foot you becomes 6 feet tall and learns how to drive and throw a punch and hold his liquor. Are there scars? Oh, hell yes. But you're not quite so weak ever again. And that's important when you have the kind of history I have. Growing up fixes some things, or at least dulls the feeling so you can function.
Andy?
Function somewhat.
Andy. Oh, you're here. You came.
Hello, Pastor Bob. How are you?
Oh, you know, it's going to be a difficult week.
I can imagine.
Just thank God there's no press. I don't think I could have stood that.
I imagine the press is only interested when pedophiles are caught, not when they die. I'm sorry, did that word embarrass you?
What? Oh no. It's not that. I'm sorry. I just...
I don't blame you, you know. I wasn't even part of those lawsuits.
Oh, I almost wish you had been.
What do you mean?
Well, Robbie Parker, Trevor Mack, and the rest, the ones that did sue, they haven't recovered like you have, Andy. Still living at home, most of them. I know what happened to them, to you. It was my fault.
No.
It was. Let's not quibble. But if they could have seen how you recovered. You have a good job. You have a life.
I have 2 divorces.
Well, yes. I guess I'm just an old man speaking out of turn. But if Robbie and Trevor and the rest could have seen how you moved on, maybe...
Maybe the denomination could have saved $10 million?
I didn't used to be this selfish, you know. I wish I could find a way to put it in a positive light. You were my best chance.
Is your office in the same place?
Yes.
Let's meet there after the funeral. I have something I need to talk to you about. That's right. It was a funeral. He volunteered with the church for 3 years until they found out about his special trips to the cabin. Then they asked him to leave and swept the whole thing under the rug for a couple of decades. Now, eventually, of course, this kind of thing became big news, and a handful of Timmy's victims came forward. There wasn't a trial. There was a lawsuit settled out of court and a series of articles in the local paper. That was all. Pastor Bob, he got off light. Now the man we had called Timmy was dead. He'd stayed in town, lived a pathetic life where people pointed and stared and shielded their children from him, until colon cancer finally ate him to death from the inside out. And now he lay in a box in a funeral home, mourned, if that is the word, by Pastor Bob, two women I didn't recognize but assumed were his family, and me. He was dead, and I was glad. But I was not satisfied. There was one more thing I wanted to do. You always keep a bottle of whiskey in your office?
What? Oh, I guess I do. I should have asked if you wanted a drink.
Keep pouring.
Oh, thank God that's over.
Yes.
Pete Olson was a godsend.
You mean the man who officiated?
Yes, he's from Badette. Came in especially. I thought it would be better if we had someone who didn't know him personally.
Yes. Relax, Bob. You look like you're going to have a stroke.
Oh, I'm sorry.
And no, I'm not going to ask the church for money. I already made that choice.
I suppose I could try and pretend that wasn't what I was thinking. I won't. I'm relieved. But...
Yes?
You do want something.
Timmy took us to a cabin on a little peninsula. It was Elks Bay, I think?
Yes.
I remember hearing it was Margaret Johnson's cabin. Is that right?
I believe so.
And she died years ago. No family.
No family.
So the cabin's still there.
I really don't know for sure. I'd have to look.
It's okay. I checked. She willed it to the church, and the church never sold it.
Always meant to do something about it. They've changed the building codes, you know. You couldn't build on that spot now. Too close to the shoreline. Structure itself is grandfathered in, but who would actually want to be there?
No one.
What do you want with it?
If that cabin isn't doing any good where it is, I want to burn it down.
What?
I want to go up there and burn it down.
Oh, no, Andy, I don't think...
I don't really need your permission. I just need the keys. I'll give them back before anyone knows they're gone.
It's arson.
It's been a wet spring, and there's no other structures nearby. Not even that many trees, if I remember correctly. And it's probably a tinderbox if it's been sitting out in the open all this time. I'll make sure the whole thing falls down on itself. The keys.
I can't condone this. It's against the law.
A lot of things are against the law, but they happen. The keys. Please.
You won't need them. The door's been hanging off its hinges for years.
Fine.
Oh, Andy, before you go, why did you come tell me this? Why didn't you just go do it?
Because I wanted you to know.
Know what?
That it was all finally over. I like you, Pastor. I always have. And he got a strange look on his face then, as if he really was having a stroke, eyes glistening, his face tinged a pale yellow. He started to rock side to side, and I had the idea he was being torn in half by the need to say something, and the fear of what that something would do.
Go home.
What?
Stay away from that infernal place. Just go home.
Why? He stared at me a while, then poured himself another stiff one, and didn't say a word. The cabin was at the end of a dirt road right on a finger of water called Elks Bay. It was, let's call it, a respectful distance from the neighbors. Most of them were summer people who might only live in these houses 3 months a year, if that. As I drove down the narrow cart path, still tinged with a patch of snow here and there, I went by dark house after dark house. Boats were sitting up on trailers, still wrapped in their winter coat of plastic. and by the time I got to the end, I was pretty sure I had the peninsula all to myself. It was late. Not dark just yet, but that time at dusk when shadow and light actually made seeing more difficult than usual. I parked on the road, nose pointed toward a concrete block about 20 feet ahead. That block marked Land's End. Beyond it, I knew there was a steep little grade, then the edge of the lake. I could just hear the water lapping against the rocks on shore. To my right, a thicket of forest. To my left, a narrow mud drive through the trees, where I could just make out the side of a clapboard shack. It's hard to really describe what I was feeling at that moment. The light made it pretty much impossible to see any details of the cabin, but I had no doubt that this was the place. It had been pretty nice once. Rough-hewn sides and a porch supported by logs, still covered with a coat of bark, very much in the Minnesota Northwoods style. But the porch sagged now, as did the roof. The front window was broken out, and the door, just as Pastor Bob had promised, hung crooked on a single hinge. On the front, someone had pried off half a dozen rough-hewn boards, which these days sell for a dear price at the lumber yard. Then, for some reason, they'd stopped, left the boards stacked there on the porch. I could imagine some character deriding the fact that all this fine, decorative lumber was going to waste, then changed his mind when forced to spend time close to the cabin. There was something deranged about the place. I knew its history, of course, but looking at it now, in the fading twilight of late winter, I thought you didn't need to know things about this cabin to feel the evil here. The cabin was like a senile old dog on a rusty chain, just waiting for someone to come too close. I went back to my car and pulled out things I brought from town. The rain was picking up, so I took shelter inside the car again. This rain, it seemed out of place somehow. This was an August thunderstorm, not a March drizzle. This far north, March is usually a snowy month. In another few minutes it was completely dark, and I was a long way from dry. The house would be soaked. The cabin would be soaked, maybe inside as well as out if the roof was in bad shape. So I decided to stay put. I had my car for shelter, I had an iPod loaded up with podcasts, and I had another item I'd brought from town. Seemed like the only thing to do was wait for the rain to stop. Then see where I stood. I'd waited this long. I figured I could wait a little bit longer. I woke. The rain had stopped. I had a vague memory of a nightmare, but it was gone now. Mist coated the inside of my car windows, and I felt a little close and sweaty for my own good. The clock on my cell phone said it was 3 a.m. The fresh air just rushed in. I took a big gulp of the smells of soggy earth and wet pine. The fresh oxygen knocked the cobwebs right out of my head, and it was at that moment that I glanced at the cabin and saw it. It took me a long minute to realize what I was looking at. All around me, the trees were black shapes against the gray sky. There were no lights down this road, and, as I said, no neighbors this time of year. But as I looked through the woods towards the cabin I had come to destroy, I saw it. I saw a light burning in the cabin window. At first, I just felt curious. I wondered who might be inside. It was only as I thought about things that I began to grow concerned, would be a good word, I suppose. There were power lines on this road, but I didn't think they stretched all the way to the cabin. I remembered a Coleman lantern from all those years ago. Those lanterns give off a hot white glow, however. The light from the cabin now was a dull yellow. A fire, perhaps? Candle? A couple of squatters? My hand tightened around my car keys, and I ticked through the options in my mind. And suddenly my plan to burn this place started to feel a little silly. What if there was someone here? What if they found me and started asking questions? I had a can of kerosene and some matches in my car. How was I going to explain that? I could come back. That was it. I could just go into town, find a motel, and get some sleep. Then maybe during the day, come back. That thought stopped me. Why during the day? What exactly was I afraid of? I got out and stood by the car a long time. I didn't want to admit how frightened I was. Just like a kid camping in the woods doesn't want to admit the campfire stories are getting to him. But while I stood next to my car, my heart still racing in my chest, I kept thinking about how Pastor Bob had warned me about coming here. Stay away, he'd said. What were the exact words?
Stay away from that infernal place. Just go home.
That's right. Infernal place. Who uses that word anymore? Infernal. What had he meant? I took a couple of steps closer to the cabin. I leaned against a tree in a spot where I could see the window clearly. There was a light bulb hanging from the ceiling. I didn't remember a light bulb. I didn't remember electricity, for that matter. Had someone come along and added it later, or was my memory just faulty? Was anything about this crazy plan making sense anymore? Answers point to no. I turned and started back to my car, and it was just then that... God, you scared me.
Peace be with you, brother. I come in search of the mighty Huzzah.
What?
You have to choose between a pint of beer and a pint of ladies. I choose the former. It's going to be a long night.
What are you? Who are you?
Just a lost one like you.
Who are you?
The hatchet man of Trestle Glen.
What?
The chainsaw man. The ape man of Lake Despair. The old crazy lumberjack with a garden that grew hands and feet.
What are you talking about?
He told them all, didn't he, Andy?
What?
He told them all. Every last campfire story. Got you good and scared so you'll want to stay close to him. Got you good and scared. And then it was time for lights out.
I don't know who you are.
You remember lights out, don't you, Andy? Do you remember what that meant?
Get away from my car.
Lights out, boys, he used to say, and no peeking.
Do you want some money? Just stay away from my car. I'll get you some money. How about that?
No peeking!
Oh, whoa. No reason to get upset.
No peeking. No peeking, them's the rules. Bad little boys peek, and bad little boys must be punished.
What are you doing? That's my car. Look. Hey! Right into the barrier. He plowed right into the concrete barrier at the end of the road. I ran up to the car. The hobo or mountain man or whatever he was flopped back in the seat. The airbag had deployed and knocked him a good wallop. Hey, you gonna be okay? Jeez, you're damn lucky you didn't have time to get going fast. What is wrong with you?
No peeking.
Okay, here, let me help you out. We can talk about this. The knife flashed into his hand. A hunting knife with a blade at least 7 inches long.
Boys who peek must be punished.
Wait, stop. You don't. And before I could stop him, he drew the knife hard across his own throat. I backed away slowly until I was about 15 feet away, just far enough where I could still hear him, for a little while anyway. Where had I read that if you cut the carotid artery, a large one just below the left ear, you bleed to death in a matter of seconds? Well, he'd gotten that artery. He'd gotten that one and a few more besides. And in a matter of seconds, all sounds coming from my car stopped. Was he a bum? An escaped mental patient? It was dark, so I hadn't seen his clothes clearly. I remember seeing a stalk of beard and a head of wild hair, suggesting he'd been out here for a while. I should go back and search him for ID. I knew that I should do this. Instead, I turned and started walking back down the road, away from my car. rain was freezing now, probably getting ready to turn back into snow for the night. If it dropped too many more degrees, it would start to stick, and then I'd be in trouble. I needed a plan. I needed something to do. Shelter. That had to be first. I didn't even glance the direction of the cabin with its single bare bulb. I marched resolutely to the next house down the road. It was about a quarter mile. And I almost tripped over the metal security sign sticking out of the yard. My plan, in as such as I had one, was to break a window somewhere, get out of the weather, and think. But security. Of course there would be security. Probably hooked up to an alarm service miles away that could hit speed dial and have the local law on the phone in seconds. What? One of the rich cabins out on the lake's been broken into? Well, we'll look right into it, and they would, too. They'd have a car here in no time. And me with a bloody corpse in my car and a plan to commit arson and Pastor Bob back in town, ready to tell them I was distraught. No, I didn't need law. I glanced up the road. The next house in line was only about 20 feet away, and the same security service sign flapped in a breeze alongside their mailbox. All the houses would have a sign. Of course they would. What I needed was shelter, and I knew there was only one place on the road I could get it. My fear was so thick, I had to come up on the cabin in stages like I was wading into ice water. Every little step, I'd feel my heart begin to beat in my ears, so much I couldn't even hear. But when I wanted to hear, I wanted all my senses with me. Eventually I got to the porch, then the window. Inside I could see a camp, probably belonging to the wild man who was back in my car. Just a sleeping bag, some clothes, a few plastic bags stuffed with indiscriminate belongings. Well, that explained where he came from. And finally, I was through the doorway and inside. The cabin had one main room, a little kitchen with a sink and a hole where the stove once was, and then another room set off in the corner. I stared at the doorway of that other room for a long time. It's funny how the layout of rooms looked wrong somehow to my eyes. I couldn't rectify what I was looking at with what I remembered. I remembered a red cooler on the kitchen counter in lieu of a refrigerator. I remember a table being right about where the bum sleeping bag was now. Board games. I remember there were always board games. Not ones we'd liked, but ones that were just a little too young for us. Chutes and Ladders and Candyland. There was a box for Battleship on the shelf, but I remember that the box was empty for some reason. The shelf. You never know what will trigger a memory. You never know what will flip the switch in your head, flooding it with smells and sounds and images from the past.
My turn now. 4, just what I needed. You're not gonna catch old Timmy tonight.
I'd glance to the wall where a little bookshelf used to be, the shelf where all the board games were kept. And the shelf was still there. Empty now, but there, just exactly as I remembered it. The rest of the cabin was a moldering hulk, but that shelf, that was like a time traveler dropped in from the past. And I was in the past, playing board games with a man I thought was weird, but I had to be nice to him, because he was nice to me.
You're my favorite, Andy. My favorite one to bring to camping time.
Mom had seemed so encouraging in this. After all, Dad was gone, and a boy needed role models.
My very favorite.
A little touch of bile caught in my throat, and I turned away from the shelf. The bedroom doorway was staring me in the face. There never had been a door there, though sometimes when more than one boy was at the cabin, Timmy would hang a blanket over the doorway. Now, it was a black hole in the world. That magical light bulb hung from the ceiling in this room, but the light it gave did nothing, absolutely nothing, to reach past the doorway into that tiny room. And as I looked, 1,000 memories flooded back, and with them, a lot of feelings. It's the guilt that gets you most. That's why the monsters can get away with it for so long. They know that children will feel guilty and keep their mouths shut. Children who know that something's wrong, but that nice people are good, and good people don't do wrong things. So, if you know something terrible's happening, and the only other person in the room is nice, well, that just leaves you, doesn't it? And the monsters are always careful to be nice. I felt a tear roll down my cheek, and I didn't care about consequences anymore. I'd cared about consequences back then, and look what it got me. No more worry. Time to reap what I'd sown. I kicked the door off its remaining hinge, and it clattered onto the porch. I marched up the mud lane to my car, and I didn't care if there was a dead man in the seat. I didn't care if the car was totaled. My whole world was a can of kerosene and the matches that I had in the back. They were my past, present, and future. They were all that mattered. I got to the car, and I ripped open the front door, and the wild man was gone. There was blood everywhere inside the car. It actually dripped from the edge of the seat to the floor mats. There's no way, I thought. No way he could have gotten up and walked away. Then I stepped back. The sound of the rain began to fill my ears. I ran through my mind everything I could about the man. Had I really seen him run the blade across his throat? Had I really seen the blood gush out all over him, all over the seat? Yes, the answer to all of it was yes. I took a quick minute to look around the car for any sign of bloody footprints, but it was raining too hard and it was too dark. If there had been anything, it was probably washed away by now. So I just circled the car. Then I circled out into the woods. My hands were quivering and my body stank. They call them panic attacks. And I hadn't had one for years, but I knew this feeling. This was reptilian brain chemistry at work, kicking in like a shot of wood grain on a raw throat. I was panicking. I was losing my grip on reality as if that word meant anything on this unholy night. And I turned away from the car, and I began trotting down the road, and I knew I risked freezing to death out there in the wilderness, but I didn't care. I didn't care about anything but getting away. I was trotting, then I was running, and then I hit something dead center of the road. At first I thought it was a tree. Then I saw that silhouette of wild hair against a cloudy sky. It was him. He was alive, but...
Hello, Andy.
The voice wasn't. That's impossible. I couldn't see the wild man's face for the darkness, but that voice...
Always.
I know that voice.
Were my favorite.
And he was on me like an animal, flailing, punching, scratching, biting even, but I pressed my hands against his face to try and fight back. I could feel his flesh. It was cold. His face was cold. His throat was wet and slippery, but his face, it was the face of a corpse. I kicked and I rolled and I got out from under him and I ran to the car. And I got the kerosene and the matches, and I didn't even look down the road towards the wild man. I just turned towards the cabin and ran as fast as I could until... He flew out of the darkness and hit me. And then he was on top of me, and he wasn't just cold. He smelled of blood and dirt and death. And his hands, cold and moist and somehow unstable, flexible, slimy, they pressed around my mouth and nose, sealing them. I thrashed, but I was suffocating. Then one of his hands convulsed and exposed part of my nose, and I breathed deep of the air that I could get, and I smelled the kerosene. It had spilled, and he was soaked with it. And in another second, I was in my pocket, and in a second after that, I had the matches. And I pushed him off. He staggered over, batting at his clothes as they burned. He was screaming and yelling and burning, and he began to run. Whether by instinct or something else, he ran right into the cabin. And the whole thing went up like the tinderbox it was. I backed away from the cabin as it burned. Maybe I was afraid to turn my back on it. Maybe I just wanted to see the moment when it finally collapsed on itself. I'd done it. I'd done what I came for. There would be a body inside. Who knows whether they would be able to identify him. My car was totaled against a concrete barrier, but I could probably explain that. Probably. How could I explain the blood, though? I didn't know. And most of all, I didn't know what I'd set on fire. What that thing was that had attacked me, and then ran burning back into the cabin. Was it a bum with superhuman strength? Was it the ghost of the man I'd come to exorcise? Was it something else? All I had was questions with no answers. I walked past the concrete barrier, down over some rocks to the shore. I slipped off my shoes, and I slipped into the lake, fully clothed. When I got about 50 feet from shore, I could feel the terror fading away. Above my head, ashes from the fire were floating like gray snowflakes on the wind. And I hoped that the monster in the ashes was going with them. Away. Forever. The Monster in the Ashes, a production of the Icebox Radio Theater, featured Tom Bement as Pastor Bob, James Yunt portrayed the Wild Man, and Jeffrey Adams was Andy. The script was written, directed, and post-produced by Jeffrey Adams. Sound effects created and edited by Dave Irwin. This program, copyright 2012, all rights reserved, by the Icebox Radio Theater, which is solely responsible for its content. On the web at iceboxradio.org.